so if you think I need a microphone, please let me know. First of all, I'd just like to say that I'm absolutely thrilled to be participating in this conference. I know it was, I found out about it at very short notice, and I'm really delighted.
Excuse me, please use your microphone, because of recording purpose. Okay, thank you.
That's totally fine. So I just wanted to say that I'm really delighted to be involved in this conference, and I look forward to hearing all of your perspectives and comments on my paper today. So I'll begin by just talking a little bit about myself, my own background and how I came across Maxwell. So I'm Irish. I studied at Trinity College Dublin, and my doctorate dealt with the historiography of the Church of Ireland, which is the Anglican Church in Ireland, Roman Catholic Church, and the Presbyterian Church during the 19th century. As I'm sure you're aware, the Presbyterian Church in Northern Ireland is very strongly affiliated with their Scotch brethren across the water. And so I looked at how in Ireland and Britain, all of these churches competed for the same historical identity and how this informed their historiography. And because Irishmen and Scotsmen travelled extensively throughout the British Empire, I also had to, particularly to places like Canada, I also had to look at the early formation of Presbyterianism within Canada. And I was really intrigued at the offshoots of the Presbyterian Church, of which the Presbyterian Church of England is perhaps one of the most unusual. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I think when we look at the missionary activity of the Presbyterian Church of England and the successful church that it has created in Taiwan, it's often, and also its many successful missions in China, I think it's often easy for us to overlook just how unusual a church the Presbyterian Church of England actually was. And I want to put it in a little bit more context before we begin. So, as I said, I studied here, which is a kind of bastion of Irish Anglicanism. I've focused on the three principal churches. So we've got the Christ Church Cathedral, St. Giles' Cathedral, and obviously we have the Church of England as well. And so I focused a lot on the relationship between these churches, and these are the established churches, and the established churches they were protected by the penal laws in Great Britain and Ireland, and dissenting traditions were excluded by the penal laws, and this was included, the Presbyterian Church of England was included in these penal laws, so it was quite an unusual church, and I just wanted to kind of highlight. I was always fascinated by it. Its architecture is very distinctive. It's a very, very small church within England. And it's a church which historically has been on the wrong side of history. So with the Church of England, it had Calvinistic or Presbyterian elements when it was first, particularly in the 16th and early 17th centuries. This obviously led to Puritanism, but I think the Presbyterian Church of England is an unfortunate victim in many ways of the kind of de-Calvinization of the Church of England. So although within the Puritan movement, the Presbyterian, what would go on to become the Presbyterian Church of England, was actually opposed to the deposing of the monarch, and was quite a kind of small fringe of the Puritan movement. When, with the Glorious Revolution and the restoration of the British monarchy and the restoration of kind of more high church Anglican ideals, it found itself kind of cast aside, kind of alienated and stigmatized as a result of kind of anti-Puritan rhetoric. And so although that association was quite unjust and unfair, the Presbyterian Church of England was went into a very, very sharp decline from its heyday during kind of Puritan movement. And by the 19th century, it was a very, very small church. In fact, it was only really augmented by large numbers of Scottish Presbyterians and Ulster Scots Presbyterians who were coming to England either for migrant work or for a variety of other purposes. And so they were really, in essence, the lifeblood of the Presbyterian Church of England. And what is really fascinating is that a church which in so many ways was unsuccessful at missioning towards English people became one of the most successful missionary churches. From such a small base, it was able to expand. And what I think is really important when we look at the history of Presbyterianism and the history of Presbyterian missionary activity within Taiwan is there are a number of currents which I think have informed current Taiwanese perceptions of the Presbyterian Church. So the Presbyterian Church of England, as I have said, was one of the most successful missionary churches of the 19th century. In contrast, their brethren in Canada, as was pointed out, this was one of their first missionary activities. Now, whereas the Presbyterian Church of England today, in its current form, is a very small church, obviously the Presbyterian Church in Canada is quite a large denomination, but at the time that they were interacting in Taiwan, they were kind of almost on a par. So one church was just beginning and the other church was a kind of leader of missionary activity. So you get this kind of surreal situation where we have a small church in England, quite a large church in Canada, but there's a parity when they come to acting in Taiwan. But I also think that historically, the kind of very strong Scottish and Ulster Scottish influence in both of those churches, particularly the Presbyterian Church movements in Canada, has informed a kind of a sense of the difference that we see a lot in Taiwan, particularly of the historic missions between north and south. That kind of divide between Tainan and Damshui and Taipei, I think has been accentuated by the fact that, you know, one tradition is very much owned by a church which is now kind of large and confident and separated and, you know, clear to establish its own identity. And then the other church, which is the origins of which are less confident. I mean, the Presbyterian presence in England to this day is quite small. It's quite muted. Certainly, they're much more muted in comparison to their Scottish and Ulster brethren, who are probably the most vocal Presbyterians you could ever wish to meet. And part of the reason I'm so fascinated is I'm from a mixed background, and in Ireland, a mixed background would be my mother is Catholic, and then my father is from a Church of Ireland and Presbyterian background. And so in Northern Ireland, there are an almost dizzying array of Presbyterian denominations and churches. And I'm calling a story where one of my first kind of interactions with the Free Presbyterians in Northern Ireland, they were telling a story about missionary activity in China. And they told about this old minister who had been ministering in Amoy and the surrounding area during the 19th century. And he came back to Northern Ireland, and he was giving a sermon, and he was asked to recite something in Mandarin. And although he was fluent in Mandarin, he panicked and just made up some kind of random piece of scripture, but attributed it incorrectly. And someone from the very back shouted, "That's not the book of Ruth, that's the book of Matthew." And it was used as an example in Northern Ireland of kind of never underestimate the knowledge of your congregation. But I think it's kind of revealing that the example that they chose was of the kind of these Chinese missions, of which obviously the mission to Taiwan was part of that kind of framework. So I thought that was revealing. Just one moment. So this is this is in Birmingham, and I think it's now a nightclub, unfortunately. But I just wanted to kind of talk about, one of the kind of major archives that I've been looking at is with regards to the Maxwell papers, which are held in the Cadbury collection in the University of Birmingham. And the reason they're located in the University of Birmingham is partly because of the origins of the Presbyterian Church of England during the 19th century. So Birmingham was a rapidly expanding industrial city. Unlike London or other places, where the established church owned the majority of the property, Birmingham, because it was expanding so rapidly, had a lot of new land and new opportunities available for churches. It was a great market for souls. And so during the 19th century, it was a real centre for smaller churches, of which the Presbyterian Church of England was one. And so they set up a small theological college, which was then incorporated in the 1970s into the University of Birmingham. And his papers were then donated there. And I'll be focusing on that specific collection, although I'd also like to point out that there are other collections in Cambridge and SOAS, and some papers about his medical career in the University of Edinburgh. But for today's seminar paper, I'm going to focus on those papers that are left in the University of Birmingham. And they're a really incredible assortment of very rich material, of which I'm sure some of you are already aware of some of the photographs of Maxwell's son, which the University of Bristol, have digitized recently. So I'll show you some of the originals of those. And also, aside from the letters, there's a lot of scrapbooks and other material which are full of kind of interesting pieces. So although the Presbyterian Church of England was unsuccessful in England, it benefited hugely from a very ambitious and well-organized, motivated missionary movement, particularly personified by people like William Chambers Burns. I think this is fantastic. I know this is for the mission in Singapore, but it's a fantastic kind of depiction. I think it sums up his confidence, also the fact that he's kind of trying to assimilate. Also, I really love the I also love the ambition of the Presbyterian Church of England, and also the fact that, as far as I'm aware, there doesn't seem to be any mention of Taiwan on this, but it gives you a kind of indication of their kind of zeal and of their determination and of their confidence as well. So I think that when we look at Maxwell, obviously he's part of, and I don't mean to use an overly Catholic term, but he's very much part of the trinity of the history of the Presbyterian Church. So we've seen that with Mackay and with Berkeley, a lot of their papers have been published, but I would argue, and the whole purpose of this paper, is that there is an equally rich amount of material relating to Maxwell. And I think that my goal is to get his letters published in the same way, along with an accompanying group of essays. So whenever you and I'll talk a little bit more about this later on, but the relationship between Maxwell and Mackay has always been a kind of slightly difficult one. And Mackay, whenever he appears in Maxwell's letters, it's not always entirely flattering. Certainly, I think that in terms of their personality, you can understand why Mackay has been such an appealing figure. Not only did he fully kind of embrace many aspects of Chinese and Taiwanese society and marry a local woman, but and often, as you can see, dressed in a traditionally Chinese way. But he was here for a longer time. He was also working in a more densely populated area, and I'm not sure about it. So this is the only mention in Mackay's from Formosa of Maxwell, but Maxwell was instrumental in Mackay coming over to Taiwan, and the letters in Birmingham contain the first mentions of Mackay and of Maxwell's opinions of him, not always positive, but sometimes kind of quite frank. These are the papers that is really successful. So he says, our present reputation rests on the curing of such legs. He's talking about the conditions that are very prevalent in Taiwan, and particularly in Tainan at this time. The letters also include the kind of practicalities of the mission. How is it funded? How are the churches funded? So here we're talking about medical supplies, and he details kind of gauze, mosquito nets, and other things like that. Here, some of them are very practical, so shoes, diamonds for cutting glass. Others are more direct. So this is talking about the direct provision of funding for the Formosa hospital, as he refers to it in his letters. And these, not only give you an idea of the cost involved and how they escalated and how he negotiated those, but also the textbooks that they were using to teach children. So, for example, in one he complains about Gilbert Burnett's History of the Presbyterian Church of England being sent, not very useful for missioning in Taiwan. But other times, over here, for example, we've got a few more textbooks that they're looking for, and sometimes he gives insights into his own views on certain parts of Scripture. So this is the conclusion of a series of seminars that he's giving on Moses, and he remarks that he thinks Moses is the most notable man in scriptural history, which is interesting. This is a pretty poignant piece of, he talks about other missionaries and their activity, and this one talks about an American missionary who's died and his daughter who is left in China. This is a particularly interesting, I'll just talk about two more letters. This one says, this is talking about the difficulties faced by the mission in Taiwan. And so it begins, if anyone were to tell you in the street of Edinburgh, some friends of yours had been seized by wicked men, and so he basically talks about how some figures have been murdered, how some figures have been cruelly beaten and imprisoned. And then, having told them such terrible tales, he then asks, could you please send some more missionaries? So having told them all of the kind of negative, he can't resist getting more Scotch brother. And little things, you constantly get a call for Chinese ministers. You also get kind of reference to events, wider political events as well. Some of them are really fascinating. One of the beautiful things about the letters is that they've been augmented or kind of, supplemented by his sons. So this one has a note from his son, which just says, "Father's first visit to Formosa." And it was certainly his first letter from Formosa. Some of them are quite distinct. This one deals with some of the problems of his interaction with Aboriginal communities. So the first meeting with savages, the charge of child murder. And this also deals with the idea that the Presbyterians were under very closely supervising, tried their name was trying to be besmirched. There's a lot of really interesting things about Aboriginal communities, but I'll leave it open to questioning. This is this beautiful photograph, and through the letters you're able to determine who she is. But as I said, my goal is that I hope I've given you a flavour of what these letters have and how they can augment and enhance our knowledge of the Presbyterian Church in Taiwan. And I think that Maxwell, maybe not as romantic or engaging a figure as Mackay, but he's just as crucial. He's the first missionary and very integral.
Yes, thank you, James. What a wonderful, very important archive that we really don't know about this. Maybe you can, I invite you, you can come to my school to give me a talk.
That would be beautiful.
Next month. Do you know Mr. Laidlaw? Okay. He collected a lot of archive from London or Maxwell. Maybe you can talk there. Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe 你看花会间不花会啊？
接着做。
我就这种不花会。Okay. Maybe after the other present we can talk.
Absolutely.